Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rejoining us on the podcast is one of my favorite guests, Matthew Pines. He is the director of security advisory at Sentinel One. We have a mind-bending conversation about the United States and China in the cyber realm, what the kinetic threshold might be for global cyber conflict, explore some dystopian theories, and close with some thoughts on Bitcoin and aliens. So not an episode to be missed, and I'm excited about this one. I hope you are as well. If you want to email me about anything you heard on this podcast or about anything you think that I need to have on my radar that I don't, email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Take care of the people you love. Cheers and see you out there. All right, Matt, there's no way we're going to get through everything I want to get through with you. So let's just dive in and get as far as we can get in an hour. And I'm sure you'll be gracious enough to come back on if I don't scare you away. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I wanted to start. Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, earlier this year, he was talking to the House Select Committee on strategic competition between the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party. We need shorter names for these things. And he talked about the CCP being the defining threat of our generation. That's not particularly new. But he said it in the context of Chinese hackers and about an FBI operation that helped take down Volt Typhoon, which maybe many listeners have not heard about, but anybody who's doing anything related to cybersecurity has obviously heard about. So there's a lot of different places we could start, but I wanted to start at the very broad level. Do you agree with that characterization, that China and specifically Chinese hackers are the defining threat of our generation? And then we can back into what the hell is Volt Typhoon? What is iSoon? Why should listeners who are not familiar with this stuff care? But I wanted to just start with setting perspectives. Do you agree with him on that?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think it's a fair assessment.
Not like nothing else scares you more, like climate change wouldn't scare you more, or your aliens coming and destroying everything, or AI like taking over the systems, or North Korean nukes.
It's I guess it's sort of how you define your terms in terms of threat to what, right? Like, yeah, Chinese hackers aren't going to like bring down civilization, right? If that's your sort of reference point for evaluating different threats in terms of to the United States' position and sort of its geoeconomic power and sort of its status in the world system. What is the main threat vector to that, and where has China had the most success thus far in achieving its strategic objectives? That's by far the most important and significant threat to the United States' global interests.
Well, then let's back into Volt Typhoon is the one that has gotten all the headlines. So do you want to talk about that one specifically, or do you want to zoom out and say, hey, the media is focusing on this, but there's honestly 5 other things that are way more important that aren't, like, probably if it's reached the media, it's been a threat that's diffused on some level, but maybe like just help us understand like what's going on, because all these weird hacker gangs are getting thrown out there. And I think it's very hard, unless you're deep in the weeds on this stuff, to actually like assess and rank importance.
Yeah, it's important to think about how China views and uses cyber as a tool in their overall approach to statecraft, and how sort of the set of tools that they've developed, sharpened, and are now wielding at scale are contributing to their larger sort of geopolitical strategic objectives, right? So these stories sort of sit in the news cycle and they get a lot of play and they're significant in their own right, but they matter much more in terms of how we interpret the unfolding kind of U.S.-China geopolitical competition, and what these sort of spillovers and sort of tail risks from that competition mean for businesses, for individuals, for kind of the evolution of the future order. So it's like these are not isolated sort of cyber stories, right? They're cyber stories that matter to the audience inside cybersecurity industries and security professionals and national security officials, but they reflect on a larger theme, which is going to be the defining theme this decade that I think Christopher Wray was pointing at, which is China's emergence as a peer competitor across many domains of state power, and they have implemented a pretty effective strategy to develop cybersecurity capabilities in an offensive capacity to drive and achieve those strategic objectives. And so this has taken many forms. The traditional sort of trope has been cyber espionage for the purposes of acquiring valuable intellectual property, trade secrets. And that has certainly been a very successful strategy for them over many years. It's still ongoing. But that's not the Volt Typhoon story. And that's not what those 4 senior security officials were really there testifying about. They were testifying about China's efforts to essentially do pre-operational surveillance and reconnaissance on American critical infrastructure networks with the objective of establishing persistence so that if they got the command to disrupt or destroy those networks, that they could effectively execute that command. And you only perform those operations if you're planning for a potential scenario where you want to disrupt, for example, the ability of the United States to use its civilian aircraft fleet to support U.S. troop mobilization, whether you want to disrupt the ability of ports to take in and out supplies, whether you want to take down emergency communication systems, whether you want to disrupt, other forms of communication in society. And so these are civilian infrastructures that are targets of Chinese military in preparing for a potential conflict scenario where they get the order to destroy and disrupt these networks. So that's why it was very important for the senior officials to sort of highlight as a particular feature of U.S. political economy when it comes to these critical infrastructure networks, which is they are not controlled or run or owned to first order by the U.S. government. So they have to try to induce or coerce via regulation or peer pressure or public pressure private sector owners and operators of critical infrastructure networks spanning wide diversity of industries and maturity levels to try to up their security game. And so this testimony had one important audience, which was the sort of senior leadership and the political audience that can change security posture and investment decisions inside those private companies that are responsible for maintaining our critical infrastructure. So it was kind of trying to raise the salience of this as an issue to try to drive momentum in those decisions, and that's what Jen Easterly, the CISA director, that's her main job is ensuring the security of those critical infrastructure networks, but she can't mandate to a large extent those folks to improve the security posture. General Nakasone, who's the NSA director, also dual-hatted as the Cyber Command director. That was actually his last day in office. He had a different audience in his testimony. His audience essentially is a sort of strategic competition communication with China to try to convince them that, one, we know what you're doing, we have visibility into your operations, and that we will not be effectively deterred by the threat of your disrupting these networks, that we are prepared and that we are ready to challenge you in the theaters of conflict, and we can retaliate in kind, if not more forcefully, if you take these actions against us. So each of those leaders had a different audience, and they were trying to message strategically, either to a domestic or international audience, in particular to our adversaries. And this is a high stakes game in terms of trying to set increasingly strict or clear boundaries around what is appropriate in cyber operations. Sort of what targets are in scope or out of scope. I think we were trying to send a strong signal that targeting critical infrastructure that could severely impact U.S. society and lead to major disruptions, if not threatens social order, is off limits. Whether China has received that signal, whether they'll adjust their operations accordingly, is TBD. But that was a major impetus: is that the scale of China's operations and activities to infiltrate and establish persistence successfully across a wide swath of U.S. critical infrastructure networks raised the alarm bell, and I think motivated a kind of all hands on deck kind of public testimony.
There's so much to dive into just there. But I wanted to first ask, does the U.S. actually have reciprocal capabilities? Like, is there a version of Matthew Pines and Jacob Shapiro having this conversation in the Chinese media context, talking about how, well, really, it's the U.S. that is pre-positioning these things on our civilian infrastructure, and we are doing this as a response? Like, do we actually have that capability?
So we certainly have extreme capabilities. The question is whether we have the similar doctrine that China has. So our current doctrine is involved sort of defend forward, where we need to establish persistent and adversary networks in order to disrupt them. Our current doctrine, as far as I understand it, I think all the details are classified, is that we have rules of engagement that prescribe, viable viable military targets that exclude and try to assess collateral damage, just like we do in other contexts. Mm-hmm. And so we have, obviously a large sort of set of lawyers that review the sort of pre-operational battle plans and how we would effectively use different capabilities, including cyber capabilities, to accomplish military effects. And there is like a, analysis of what sorts of things would be within scope. My understanding is that is certainly not at the scale of what China has currently, indicated in terms of their broad strategic effort to compromise, core critical infrastructure to our basic social existence. and whether we would respond in kind in a cyber domain or whether we would escalate in an alternative domain, e.g., our strategic deterrence, is an open question. And that gets into like larger complex policy discussions about at what point does cyber trip kinetic threshold. If you take down if you open up a dam and it floods and it kills 1,000 people, right? You didn't bomb us, but you effectively caused the deaths of our citizens, and we'll respond, accordingly. It gets complicated, but that is, those are live discussions.
Yeah, I want to that question, but there's one question I want to ask you before we get into a discussion about that, because that's where your world bleeds into my world in a pretty huge way. Um, the other big thing that's been in the headlines for the last couple of months when it comes to China cyber is this leak from iSoon that they posted a bunch of stuff, or somebody posted a bunch of stuff on GitHub, and it showed that there's a lot of private contractors in China that are doing this work, whether they're doing it opportunistically, they go and get some data and try and get a contract from the Chinese Communist Party after the fact, or whether they're being told by the CCP to go and do this. And sort of, you talked about, state to state sort of conflict. It seems to me that releasing the dam is not at all. That's a bomb right there. But what if it's a private contractor that did it? And what if it's not actually the state? And what if a private contractor goes rogue? And you even were mentioning this in the context of the US, like the US government can't control all of these private companies with their infrastructure and things like that. So do we have this strange world where, the states may be looking at each other and, huffing and puffing and scaring and deterrence, but there's a bunch of private actors that don't give a shit. They're just running around doing whatever they want and, Dark Knight style, want to see the world burn. Like, how do we find or understand that relationship there?
Yeah, so certainly what you've seen in China is similar to what you see in sort of any industry, is like when the government invests in an industry, especially from a state perspective, usually there's like remora fish, right? There's a whole ecosystem that then develops around that sort of state priority, right? So the state has decided that, offensive cyber capabilities are a national strategic priority, and they're going to invest in the sort of bureaucratic programs and processes and tools and sort of educational and training pipelines. And of course, it's that generates a lot of contract opportunities for the private sector in any country, including China, to kind of try to capitalize on that. And China is very much a top-down sort of strategic direction, but then they sort of a lot of autonomy is given to sort of individual provinces and sort of bureaucratic offices to kind of execute against that top-level kind of political mandate. And there's also opportunities for a lot of back scratching and kind of like influence peddling that you see in a lot of these iSoon contractor type leaks, where it looks like typical bribes, and how can I get in good with the political officials to get the contracts. As far as the tactical or operational impact, so I wouldn't expect that like just a freelancing contractor is going to go hack a dam, right, from China, right? Like they don't have the incentive to do that, right? Like, so what the ecosystem says is that they have a sort of a rough gray market for access, and also like certain data that they happen to steal. And there are certain idiosyncratic cases where they steal something and they're like, I'm desperate for cash, and they try to sell it to somebody. And that does happen. But there is also a more organized, kind of top-down, state-directed set of sort of targeting priorities that translate through different portions of the bureaucratic ecosystem. So a large portion of that goes from like, okay, we want to gather what effectively is industrial espionage, economic intelligence for strategic science and technology sort of targeting priorities. And those kind of filter through different bureaucracies, including the sort of Ministry of Science and Technology and the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And they kind of are more in terms of like, here are the industries that we want to target. Here's the technologies, the critical technologies that we are interested in. They have a whole cadre of science and technology diplomats that are sort of scouting different companies and sort of industry associations and writing technical reports. And they're not technically intelligence officers. They're just essentially science and technology diplomats. But that information sort of flows back into the intelligence bureaucracies. And China has different ways of going after this. Sometimes they try to, use like legal gray zone means, whether it's just, joint ventures, actual acquisitions. They try to like induce or recruit insiders to come over and sort of just transfer the IP with them. But they also use, illicit means where they, want to hack it. And there's a whole ecosystem of contractors that actually China sort of rates and sort of gives them different tiers in terms of they have to, on one side is just developing vulnerabilities, right? There's a whole, portion of the cybersecurity industry which is just trying to, develop unique access points and ways of exploiting software. And so you're trying to incentivize companies to, do that hard work of identifying vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And so there's a rich ecosystem inside China of sort of that, both like cybersecurity competitions where they incentivize companies to come and compete, develop vulnerabilities, and then those vulnerabilities get fed into kind of these national databases that just so happen to make their way into PLA or MMSS.
Right.
Sort of cyber hacking units. My colleague Dakota Carey has kind of mapped that whole ecosystem. But I wouldn't worry too much about contractors like taking out a dam. Like, there's not much of an incentive for a lot of those private those sort of privateers to do that, but they would sort of spray and pray sometimes in terms of targeting different firms, and then maybe try to find a willing buyer. It's a complicated ecosystem in terms of this matchmaking service between getting information that does or doesn't fit a particular targeting priority by a particular entity inside the ecosystem. It could be the PLA that really is targeting U.S. defense industrial base targets, or strategic critical infrastructure for the purpose of some tactical battle plan, in which case those are like definitely on the PLA's, like they're going to tightly manage and control any activities that go after those targets. And there's a broader sort of ecosystem of folks looking at general diplomatic information, what the Tibetan leadership is saying about whatever. Of course, there's a huge portion of China's cyber efforts that involves sort of overseas repression of political dissidents and trying to identify politically sensitive speech by citizens or other activists in other jurisdictions. So a lot of these tools are being developed and then wielded by the state. And there is certainly top-down management of a lot of those, especially strategically important activities. But there's a lot of sort of freewheeling entrepreneurial activity as well.
Yeah, I mean, my sense of this, and I feel like this is true in sort of the approach to intelligence in general. Whereas if you think about the Western approach to intelligence, it's, the James Bond going in and getting the piece of information or defusing the bomb and very precise, everything, a mission that has been planned with plans within plans. Whereas China, I feel like it's just throw everything at the wall. We have 1 billion people. Let's send out 50 million soft agents. And maybe one of them stumbles upon something, and then we go visit him and get the information or activate this, person in that particular way. It seems less like it's just a different approach in general, which I think bleeds into all of their geopolitics. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, I mean that certainly has been the trope in assessments of Chinese intelligence over decades. Is famously they'll pick up every grain of sand, right, and then kind of assemble it back home into some mosaic. I think they've become a little bit more sophisticated recently. They've certainly their bureaucratic system sets up this intense competition between the MSS and the PLA. Recently, the MSS was just elevated in importance in kind of the bureaucratic system. And the MSS, I think, accordingly, is trying to up their tradecraft across the board. And so cyber is just one element of that, and it's really very capable cyber actors. But their approach to sort of human asset recruitment, the sort of the tried and true Western methods that the British pioneered, and then the U.S. and the Soviets kind of really turned into an art form in the Cold War. The Chinese, were kind of late to that game. And the MSS was kind of this, backwater in the political circles in the 80s, effectively, and took into the 90s for them to get really themselves together. But they weren't really like what we would see as like a tier one national, foreign intelligence service. But really in the past 15 or 20 years, they've like upped their game substantially, in particular, like recruiting deeply sourced human assets where they have intelligence requirements and they can compromise Western individuals. And it isn't just people with Chinese heritage. That's sort of the trope is they'll, induce or recruit or coerce, folks with family connections they can exploit. There's a lot of Westerners, American blue-blooded folks that will sing for their sing for money, and they've had success in compromising even our intelligence services. So I think it's important not to underestimate their abilities as an intelligence service. But yeah, they do also have just a ton of bodies. I mean, they have a lot of people. There's also that's vulnerabilities that they have that we can exploit, right? As this ISOON leak told us, like, you see these hackers working for this contractor, they're making like $1,000 a month, right? And they're complaining about their poor pay. And and I think that exists in every bureaucracy where there's resentment. There's, especially China's economy isn't doing so well. Sort of the boom times that would have manna falling from heaven on this whole ecosystem are starting to, potentially dry up a bit. And that, that creates opportunities on the other end. But yeah, I think they have become very successful in recent years in, accomplishing what they need to accomplish. And on the flip side, I mean, there was a story 12 years ago, I think, when China effectively rolled up dozens of U.S. intelligence assets
Mm-hmm.
in country. And I believe Daily Beast reported about how that happened, and it was effectively our poor tradecraft. Like, we had a covert communications app that we programmed for use in battlefield operation environments by a contractor for the CIA, basically to give to some guy in the street in Afghanistan or Baghdad to help alert us to when an IED was going to be planted. So you wouldn't put a whole lot of effort into protecting that app, right? But then the CIA officers went to China and they brought this app along with them, and they were comfortable with using it, and we decided to use it in some of those source operations. And apparently Iran found an exploit in Iraq or Afghanistan, wherever it was, and they shared that with China and Russia. And China then used that, maybe along with other information they had from a potential insider in the CIA that they had recruited, to roll up essentially a large swath of our in-country asset network. And it took many, many years. I think Will Burns has talked about, the CIA director, that they're now reconstituting their human collection network, but China is a hard target for a reason.
Well, and I mean, this is where I worry about the bureaucratic gridlock in the US government as well. We could argue whether it starts with Obama or Trump, but I mean, appointments and recruiting and sort of replenishing human capital in all of these different organizations within the US, from my point of view, is sort of stopped just because of all the partisan back and forth. I mean, you've got backlogs of years for people like completing interviews and things like that. So I worry about that too. Let's dig into the sort of big question that I avoided until now, which was, and you described it as a kinetic threshold, which is a good phrase for it. What is the kinetic threshold for China flipping the switch? I think for a lot of people, that day I was in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, when the AT&T network went out. And by the way, I've said this on the podcast already. Absolutely loved it. I hope AT&T crashes a few more times. I actually had to get a map to get where I was going from point A to point B. Nobody bothered me for a whole day because nobody could get to me on my phone. It was like, really, I felt like I was in the 90s again. It was really special. And obviously that didn't, I mean, at least nobody is saying that was a hack. It looks like it was AT&T messed up or something like that. But what is the threshold for China to say, okay, here, cell service for 3 top networks goes away, or the port at New Orleans, we're going to stop having that function? Or is it an invasion of Taiwan? Is it a response to something the US does? Is it World War III? Like, how do we think about that?
This is a critical question. And it's one we think a lot about, and it's one that there's no, I think, right answer to, but there's certain, I think, plausible scenarios that are worth seriously thinking through. In particular, I think the scenario that I anchor on a lot is one where there is escalating diplomatic tension between the U.S. and China. It could be over many different things. It could be India-Pakistan. It could be an India-China border dispute that spills out of control that then cascades into other sort of regional theaters. It could be a pure Taiwan kind of like, we're going to increasingly constrict what looks like a de facto quarantine that isn't a declared blockade. It could be a tit for tat escalation in the Scarborough shows with the Philippines that we get involved in. It could be a North Korean thing that then brings. So there's lots of potential geopolitical triggers that could bring U.S. and China into an acute diplomatic fracas, where now they're trying to wield whatever levers of coercive power they have against each other within certain limits to try to contain the escalation, but try to send deterrent or compellant signals to the other side. And that would trigger potential escalation ladder. And I think along the escalation ladder is when you might see the use of more overt cyber operations on the United States. And the question is how far along the escalation ladder. But in our assessment, it isn't going to be China is invading Taiwan now. Missiles are flying, and then the cyber stuff is happening at the same time. It's much more likely the cyber stuff, portions of it, would be deployed along that escalation ladder for the purposes of, well, really two key purposes. One, probably the most important one, essentially is strategic communications to the American public, right? It's essentially, trying to dissuade or undermine the political unity that would be necessary for politicians to, say, mobilize for a conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say like, hey, we don't want to have our internet down for a week. We don't want, half the airlines to be grounded. We don't want to have, port, snarls and new inflation rippling. So it would be a deterrent effect to try to coerce us domestically and change our political decision making to force us to back down along the escalation ladder before there is even a conflict. And then, of course, if that doesn't succeed, then there is actual objectives to disrupt our ability to effectively mobilize for and conduct a conflict. right? And so those are separate capabilities to disrupt our military mobilization, our command and control, communication systems, aspects of our infrastructure that support military operations. And those would be specific to, the assets and capabilities that we would be moving into theater, or the capabilities we already have in theater, e.g. in Guam, Hawaii, and our allies in Japan and South Korea. And of course, on Taiwan itself, they would, look to immediately in advance of an invasion, probably use cyber to soften it up, right? It could be cutting off its communications, hitting power infrastructure, emergency communications, et cetera, to try to soften up for an actual invasion. And that would probably be used in combination with physical sabotage, other political potential assassination attacks. So depends where along the escalation ladder in the scenario you are, and in terms of how much of what cyber capabilities would be used. I think we've seen from the Ukraine, there's a lot of been written about after boom, right? Like the value of cyber goes down dramatically, right? Like we've sort of seen cyber hasn't really been strategically relevant in the Ukrainian conflict. There's been, high profile incidents, satellite attacks early on. There's also been, counterattacks in terms of Ukraine hitting the Russian tax service. There's been, successful examples of Ukraine able to compromise the command and control infrastructure for some of Russia's drones. But these are mostly like more like niche kind of tactical activities. They haven't really changed the strategic balance, which is, men and missiles and tanks. And, at that point, cyber becomes less strategically relevant. So I think that's most of the things that I think about is like, we haven't really tested this for real, right? We don't really know what the social impact of these activities are, as opposed to the sort of the battlefield impact.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is the nature of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I mean, I imagine if you're in a multi-theater conflict with China, and we're now talking about coordinating naval with air with human power. I mean, that you can see how that would require more than just sort of Russia and Ukraine slogging into each other in a World War I style conflict in general. Another way to ask this question, we've talked a lot about the U.S. and China here for good reason. But I mean, the big news, I think this might end up being the biggest news of 2024 is the Houthis and what they've accomplished with the United States, what the kinetic threshold for the Biden administration was to intervene, still not capable of quelling the Houthis at all. Now, did they intentionally cut the cables? Was it they sunk a ship that the anchor accidentally cut the cables? I don't know, but you've got like the main disruption to sort of the physical infrastructure of the digital world is coming because of a ragtag non-state actor backed by Iran in the Red Sea. So who should we be thinking about besides the United States and China? Because in some ways, probably the threat's not going to come from those two, because as you said, those two will have rules of engagement and will have strategic goals, and there'll be open lines of communication. Like it's probably going to be somebody who doesn't care about all those things that's going to do something.
Yes, and I sort of put this in a larger, maybe theoretical construct or schema, which is a combination of two things. One is like the neo-medievalization of our sort of global institutions, in the sense that non-state actors are becoming like de facto sovereigns in many respects, and that applies not just to groups like the Houthis, but to like multinational corporations like Elon Musk and SpaceX, and multinational banks and hedge funds operating out of the Caymans that have trillions of dollars. And so it's like the global order, the system that we think of that dominates sort of power relations, is definitely not only state dominated in terms of the sovereign interests and sort of realist view of international relations. So that's like to first order, like the model of the world you have in terms of which groups have power to influence strategic events is changing dramatically. And that is enabled by sort of my second main sort of thesis, which is like what is enabling that changing sort of the institutional power structure. Is a lot of it is essentially the digitalization of the world system. And that sort of provides asymmetric opportunities to smaller sets of actors to accrue and deploy capabilities and wield those capabilities at a strategic scale. And so this is it takes, and the structure of the global system certainly magnifies the ability for that. And the Houthis is a great example where, like, the Red Sea is both a maritime choke point for global trade, which has now become increasingly globalized system. China trade through the Red Sea, and essentially vice versa is like it's one of the key nodes in the global trade system. So that's a maritime choke point, but it's also a digital choke point because a large portion of the internet traffic from Europe to Asia goes through fiber optic cables that go through the Red Sea. And you can just look on a map. It's essentially literally a choke point for both trade and digital sort of information flows. And yet you see this sort of ragtag militia group that essentially is exerting de facto sovereignty and effectively area denial to the world's most powerful navy and its coalition of allies to effectively act as, like in the ancient Roman Empire, like bandits on the roads, right? That when you saw that, and the Roman Empire wasn't able to effectively project its hegemonic force along that sort of globalized network that it was building, you saw a change in sort of the reaction by sort of local individuals, right? That was sort of the beginning of what you saw as the medieval era, is like these institutions sort of grew up in that power vacuum, and you saw traditional kind of, okay, like boundaries of who I trust and who I'm loyal to and who now I have to pay essentially new taxes to, right? Or protection money, right? And so the Houthis are sort of playing that old game, which is like, this is a global choke point that now we can effectively extort taxes from global traders. Sort of neo-private, sort of a new form of both real piracy as well as sort of digital piracy, which you see playing out with ransomware. So I see like ransomware groups and Houthis are different manifestations of the same underlying phenomenon in this world that allows actors to essentially conduct traditional forms of extortion and blackmail, protection racket type operations, like mafia type operations, but wield the fact that the global system is both asymmetrically exposed to a few choke points and as well as digitally interconnected. And so they can conduct those operations at scale around the world, right? It used to be like a mafia could only extort, the shops in its local area. Now you can have criminal ransomware gangs, in Belarus or whatever, extort every American business at will. And so that's a fundamental change to sort of how the state system has traditionally operated. And I think governments are still trying to play catch up. They still don't quite understand how to fit this into the model. The Houthis are a good example where, $10,000 drone, requires a $2 million SM-2 missile to take down. And that cost asymmetry is not going to work in the favor of an already indebted and overstretched hegemonic military force. So these are not great trends for the United States. And these are trends that, our adversaries are looking to exploit. And so the Houthis are not just the lone actors, right? They're proxies of a state adversary that's in a sort of loose coalition with our main great power competitors. And there's a lot of material, technology, and financial collaboration among that group to challenge the Western liberal-led order and to sort of try to rewrite the economic and security architecture of that global system. So these things are all I think, of a piece. Essentially, we're competing over who's going to sort of own these new global networks, whether it's trade networks, financial networks, digital networks, and we're seeing the competition play out for how do you wield effectively surveillance and choke point control over these global networks. U.S. has typically had dominance over those networks, right? Whether it was the NSA, sort of nobody but us. We have all the capabilities passing anybody else. So we have sort of unquestioned dominance over sort of the digital high seas. That is now, I think, no longer the case. And so you're seeing sort of this multipolarity play out, not just in sort of, traditional economic terms, but in terms of like hard network power terms. Who has the power to corral both capital resources as well as data flows, computing resources, trade flows, and wield those powers in a strategic objective. So that's the 10,000-foot level view, and the Houthis, I think, are a case study.
Yeah, it's a scary view. First, you've probably seen the meme about how often men are thinking about the Roman Empire. So it only took us 30 minutes in the podcast to get there. I think that probably puts us standard deviations above most men in the world. But it's funny, like, and I fully cop to, as somebody who focuses on geopolitics, like geopolitics and realism, as you mentioned, is all about state actors. And it's created when the state actor is rising and replacing sclerotic multi-ethnic empires and kings and things like that. And I used to have long arguments with Roger Baker, who comes on this podcast sometime, about whether you could apply geopolitics to a non-state actor. He would say, absolutely not. Like, the discipline was designed to understand states. If it is not a state, like, you can't, you're going to have to find something else. I always said sort of yes, but the Houthis are a good thing because, or a good point, I think, for another reason, because, and maybe this is a bias of mine, I don't lose that much sleep about China over the next 5, 10 years. And it's because I feel like I know what they want to do. I know what their constraints are. I know what they're not going to push past. Like, there is order there. And even if it's a different form of order and one that I might personally oppose, fine. But like, China's not going to surprise me. Like, I know what they want to take back for themselves. Whereas the Houthis, like, I don't know. And you mentioned, Iran is backing them. Look at other Iranian proxies like Kataib al-Hezbollah, which killed those U.S. soldiers in Jordan and then immediately came out and said, oops, because Iran probably told them that wasn't what they wanted. Like, you can't control the proxies that well. I tweeted about this last week. I was flabbergasted because I forget which mainstream publication it was in, but they were talking about the Houthis, and they just like it was normal, reference the Houthi telecommunications ministry. And I was like, the Houthis have a telecom ministry? So how long until they have a hacking network that actually goes and goes to a dam or goes to a port and does exactly sort of what you're talking about? Like, that scares the crap out of me. And in the context of a multipolar world, I mean, what started World War I? The Black Hand, like an assassin in some part of I forget if the Archduke, where he was assassinated, was it in Vienna or Belgrade or whatever else, but like, it wasn't the state actors that pushed the things forward. It was the random bandit on the roads, as you sort of say. So that's the sort of stuff that keeps me up at night.
I think you're right. I think this, I would say, fragmentation of traditional sovereignty is taking place at two different levels, right? One is the level of kind of traditional ethnic groupings. Like, the Houthis you just come out of nowhere, right? They have a long sort of ethnic and sort of cultural heritage and sort of unity in Yemen that was always sort of politically suppressed. And it took like a tipping point of technology sort of becoming democratized enough that sort of the ideological and political aspirations of that grouping, and the fact that they're in a geographically favored area that could sort of be aligned with the, ambitions of a particular, like regional hegemon, sort of converge to then give them this asymmetric capability, right? That is now changing, strategic decision making. And I think you can see that play out in many different domains, not just sort of this traditional kind of cultural regional domains. I think you're seeing it play out just like in the, what I think is an under-assessed, aspect, which is just like non-state power and sovereignty at the level of corporations, right? Like, Avril Haines gave a fireside chat last year at the Special Competitive Studies Project, their inaugural conference in DC. I went to it. And she said something very interesting. She basically said, in sort of a bit of a halting manner, she was like, we now have to like assess global trends and global dynamics with like a new player in mind. And that is sort of big tech, mainly big corporations, but specifically like big tech. And they have to sort of bargain with these entities as if they were pure powers, right? They have to use mechanisms that they would otherwise use against like states, with how to bargain with Elon Musk, how to bargain with Sam Altman, right? Like, how do you, these are different levels of power that have never traditionally been in the private sector. There's always been a nice, from the U.S. government's perspective, kind of there's an umbrella of the state, and they will incubate technology, right, from the space race, and developing a whole bunch of spin-off technologies that became the internet, everything else. Like, there's sort of been a modus vivendi with private industry. There's always kind of aligned to U.S. government interests, right? And we would sort of globalize the world system and create all sorts of opportunities for liberal capitalism to kind of exploit those markets. And there was kind of like there was a mutual alignment of interests here. I think you're reaching a point where like multinationals have kind of saturated the global system. And now they don't trust the U.S. government is going to be able effectively to open new markets anymore, right? It's not happening. In fact, those markets are closing. China's market is now becoming more sovereign. European market is becoming more sovereign. Like, every nation is both, is sort of retrenching in terms of their approach to globalization. They still want globalized trade, Ricardian comparative advantage, but they want to put more sort of security gates around, what sorts of trade policies are going to be employed, what sorts of data flows are going to be allowed, like AI regulation, privacy regulations. All these things are essentially leading to a balkanization or fragmentation of global markets, especially digital markets, which is what global multinational corporations effectively sell. They require globalized platforms to really achieve the economies of scale. And look at the traditional relationship they had with, U.S. government as the security guarantor, or the sort of the underwriter of a certain economic architecture, as sort of not being there anymore, right? Or being fundamentally discounted. And so then they have to change the terms of how they operate, and who they choose to do deals with, and how they sort of calibrate against different centers of power in the global system. And they also have the juice. They have the hard capabilities. SpaceX can launch more rockets into space than any other, even nation state on the planet, right? Like Foundation Frontier Model Labs has some of the most advanced capabilities in those strategic domains. TSMC, ASML, like these are private companies that are like have strategic technologies and choke point. And so the state is trying to sort of use them to accomplish the strategic objectives. So he's like, for example, like the chip and export controls. And you're seeing, I think, a real-time test of how much actual sovereign power can the state effectively wield over these strategically powerful private entities to pursue their own sovereign ends. And where is that line? I think will be sort of the litmus test of how far that sort of, how far the order has shifted.
Yeah. As a fellow nerd about Ricardian economics, I'm pretty sure security gates and Ricardian economics don't work together. So if you're talking about security gates and sovereignty, Ricardo is probably rolling over in his grave. I agree with everything you just said. It also makes me think that Bladerunner is much closer to our reality than it ever was in the past. But something you said earlier that I wanted to go back to, which touches on this, is we talked about how the state is behind on a lot of these trends, and by that I don't mean the United States. I mean just the state in general as an abstract concept. And the question is, can the state actually catch up? I mean, it goes to your question. In China, we're seeing that China's trying. So Jack Ma, you say something that the party doesn't like. Okay, like China's going to fuck up your company, and it's going to make sure that you understand that you don't get all the treasures and everything else that you used to get. In some sense, the Chinese tech environment was defanged relatively easily. Now she has moved on to the real estate sector, and that is proving to be a lot harder than bringing the tech companies to reign, I guess, in China. Like, do states, especially in the Western context, where things like freedom and free markets and things like that still hold such currency, like, do they even have a chance? I take that in whatever direction you want.
So I'm not like the full, like, we're going to go, devolve into a anarcho-capitalist, right? Like the state's going to collapse. I just think there's a lot of institutional inertia. These systems tend to last a lot longer. Like even in the Roman Empire case, it was centuries before, and it sort of was a very slow, from inside those systems on any given sort of individual bureaucrat's lifespan, it didn't look like a whole lot was changing. Right. It was okay, things aren't quite as effective or efficient, or now there's a new problem I have to deal with. But like from that sort of zoomed in scale, it doesn't look like a systemic regime shift. But if you zoomed out in the scale of, at least decades to probably centuries, it would manifest as a pretty significant regime shift. And so I think it matters the time scale, right? Like in this decade, is this dominant Westphalian state system going to like go away? No. Right. In the next several decades, could we evolve to a fundamentally different state defined international system? I think that's probably true. The question is what it's going to look like. I think it's going to be heavily dependent on the future evolution of technology, right? Fundamentally. And what are these sort of substrate, often state systems are, founded on a certain economic substrate. And the technology and the economic substrate is itself sort of technologically determined, right? If you have an industrial revolution that can concentrate urban populations and that gives, new political systems, sort of space to evolve, you could see something dramatically unfold in terms of a changing pattern of technological development that shifts patterns of human migration, communication, political power, et cetera. And I don't know, I have no crystal ball how this would unfold, but I think you're seeing such massive radical changes in the technology landscape and sort of substrate that I think those inevitably will have massive political ramifications. I think we are heading to sort of like a somewhat of a divergence, though, is like you could see kind of in this chaotic system like two equilibrium points, right? One is like a Chinese style equilibrium point, which is essentially like the fantasy of the Gauss plan, which is that you could use essentially, potentially AI to actually centrally manage and control a political system and an economic system. Like if that's possible, right? And I don't know, like we'll see, but I don't think it's something you can rule out, right? Certainly in the 20th century, it was not possible. But that would potentially enable a form of like totalitarian digital control and also effective economic, governance. We'll see, right? I mean, everyone has philosophical arguments, but I think fundamentally it's an empirical question, right? And everyone says, "Oh, China's going to collapse. China's going to collapse." And I'm like, well, they haven't, right? So it's like I wouldn't just put our strategic chips in the basket of assuming that communist, central planning is like, ruled out sort of a priori. Right? Like there's new things in the world, right? There are new capabilities that states can wield to reinforce their institutional power and sort of, maybe potentially delay indefinitely this, potential decay process. Whereas Western institutions, right? Like we have a a political, hard line potentially against going towards that type of centralization. And is there is there a different model, right? A decentralized, equilibrium point. The question is, how far does that go? Right? There's like the Bitcoiner kind of like anarcho-capitalist, like Balaji type like network state, equilibrium mode. And I think that's still probably too far on the end, right? I think we're probably going to end up somewhere in the messy middle with new institutions that just will look somewhat similar to the ones we have now, but fundamentally will be structurally different. But they won't. I don't think it'll be like a radical shift. I think it'll be an evolution there that will look natural over time, but the endpoint we get to will be very different.
Yeah, I mean the only analyst I know out there that is still doing the China's going to collapse thing is Peter Zeihan, who people ask me about all the time. And I just want to say, Peter, if you're listening, come on anytime, and I will happily debate this point with you, because it would be fun to take apart why China's not going to collapse. And I will give you all due respect, and it will be very sweet. I'll be very gentle. And maybe you'll be writing me in. Maybe I'll look like an idiot. Sorry, go ahead.
So the one connection point to this very thesis is, like his main point is China's, demographics are collapsing, they're indebted, et cetera. One fascinating sort of corollary of this thesis about digital network competition, that China's strategy, especially like the digital Silk Road, is effectively trying to effectively expand its sovereign borders, right, without changing the political terms of those borders, right, but effectively changing like which populations, and effectively billions of people in the global south, across Eurasia and Africa, South Asia, that are effectively in its digital sphere of influence, that contribute to its like essentially a super block of tradable goods economy, right? And where they have essentially, a lot of structural demand from growing populations in Africa. They have got all the resources of the Middle East for like hard, commodity inputs with Russia and OPEC. They've got, their own vertically integrated kind of tech stack, right? I mean, the big loophole there is TSMC and ASML. That might hold them up, for a few years, but can they never get there? I don't think so, right? And so you have to look at it not just in terms of China as like a traditional way CIA would traditionally do, like the World Fact Book, and be like, what is their GDP going to show in 5 years? Like, that's not the right question to ask. It's like, what is the sort of the network system that they're building, and how is the contribution of that network system going to be geopolitically and geoeconomically and digitally aligned to their interests, right? Versus what we think of as the traditional Western pole, and that's the most critical question.
Well, and those interests also transcend the Chinese Communist Party. Like what you described, let's say the Chinese Communist Party collapses tomorrow. Like, it's true that one of the scenarios would be a sort of warring states period, like previous periods with warlords. But that's not what China looks like today. China doesn't look like it's fragmenting at all. If anything, it looks like the central government is getting more power. So probably just a new emperor would rise, or some new political ideology would sit on top of this entire base that the Communist Party has built for 70 or 80 years. But but besides that sort of random rabbit hole, I did want to go back into the Bitcoin thing, and also sort of energy from what you're talking about. And you can see this with these private companies too. Like, all these companies are talking about building their own nuclear reactors, building their own solar fields, like no longer being dependent on a government for energy, which, I mean, now you're taking away sort of core parts of the government. So if you do get, to your point, if you get some kind of fusion breakthrough, or even if you can drive down the cost of installation of solar and all these other things to the point where companies no longer like the threats that a government would impose upon them no longer reign true, like then like that sort of works. And sort of same from currency. I've been a crypto skeptic for a long time, and you've still been willing to come on here. But in this world that we're talking about, suddenly something like Bitcoin looks a lot more interesting if you are trying to protect assets, whether you're a business or an individual or even a rival state. Suddenly these cryptocurrencies look a lot more sort of geopolitically realistic than they did even a couple of years ago, once you take this scenario to its logical end.
Yeah, and I think one great place to look to sort of see these different trends manifesting is the United Arab Emirates. I think they are a prism that you could look through to see all of these sort of forces kind of converging. And I was actually just talking to a buddy of mine who was, works in the Bitcoin industry, was just in Dubai for 3 weeks, and I think in Abu Dhabi as well, meeting with government officials about setting up essentially operations there. And it was like they rolled out the red carpet, right? They were in the white glove treatment. They were like, "We want you. We'll do whatever it takes," right? And they've passed laws in the past year or two, sort of digital finance, digital asset laws. And if you actually talk to like what they won't say publicly, right? Like the writing on the wall for a lot of like, you might say like techno capital and a lot of capital in traditional contexts, like Gulf capital, oil money, that traditionally put all their money in like Swiss banks or German banks or London real estate. They see, right, that those assets are not as safe as they used to be. Right. So to your point, right, like where do certain pools of global capital look to for improved safety? Bitcoin might provide an opportunity for that. But not by itself. I think Bitcoin would have to be combined with sort of certain legal jurisdictional innovations, right? So like the Emirates have really pioneered this. In fact, it was City of London lawyers that basically wrote the legal framework for the Dubai Finance International Center or National Finance Center, DFC. This is sort of modeled after the City of London, which has sort of its own autonomous sort of semi-sovereignty inside England. And the DIFC has essentially the same thing inside Dubai, where it's like has its own sort of securities laws, its own sort of legal framework, has its own judges. They're all like mostly Western judges, and so they're kind of creating this little like capital entrepot to sort of take advantage of this increasing sort of multipolarity, and also a lot of folks that maybe saw the piercing of the Swiss bank secrecy laws and now the seizure of the Russian reserves as like the straw that broke the camel's back of the traditional kind of quid pro quo underlying the Western kind of geoeconomic system, where the treasury security was the sovereign reserve asset that everyone had to hold, and it would be never politicized, no matter what you do, right? Because it's like that's the bedrock upon which everyone holds their national savings. And yet, even though we haven't declared war on Russia, we haven't, triggered the sovereign sort of exception to those traditional norms, we're actively pushing in the G7 to not just block, which we already did, but seize the Russia's reserves. And this is kind of a technical thing about where they are, whether in the Bundesbank, which would not look great historically, right? Like Germans seizing Russian money has a bad sort of historical analog. It would sort of feed into Russian propaganda. And so this is so Dubai is sort of setting themselves up to try to be like this middleman, right? Where they can sort of play off the Western and the Asian power centers against each other. And I think Bitcoin and similar ideas, like people talk about de-dollarization and the Chinese yuan taking over. I think, no, that's not the way it's going to go. And like no one wants to hold the Chinese bond, right? And maybe on the margin, maybe the Saudis will hold like a tiny fraction of it to kind of keep them happy. And everyone will kind of like rebalance a bit to keep different, competing multipolar centers happy. But then they might see, okay, like in this much more competitive geopolitical dynamic, any given side could try to weaponize my exposure to them against me as a point of leverage in whatever future conflict or dynamic. What's an asset that I can hold that isn't going to be subject to that type of leverage, right? And it could be gold, it could be hard commodities, it could be rare, or it could be art in like a tax shelter somewhere. It could be Bitcoin. And so I think now there's an increasing incentive for a basket of sort of neutral reserve assets to get new flows into. And I think you can see that reflected in some of these moves. I think I was told there's like billions of dollars now that is on the move, and it could be a major new world we live in a few years.
Yeah, if not trillions. And I mean, I'm going to step, or at least a preview. I mean, some of the podcasts that we're going to do in the future is precisely that. If you are in a Western jurisdiction, how companies like CI or Bespoke or these others are actually helping people protect their assets in this way. Like this is something that's become even real and tangible for us and how we're helping manage wealth in that sense. But it also, I joked with you before we got started that I'm going to try to write a book this year. And it's not a joke. I'm really going to try and actually set aside the time to write a book. And I don't know exactly what it all looks like, but there is going to be a chapter in there about the 21st century city-state. And Dubai is going to be one of them. And there's going to be a couple other, because this system that we're talking about, like the digitalization has not been there in the past, but we have seen the rise of these types of city-state-esque actors who can grab an inordinate share of power and wealth from a global system that is becoming more chaotic around them. And I joked that we were in Bladerunner world, but this is the Hunger Games is the right dystopian analogy for that sort of world, where you do have these cities that then take the resources around them and create networks around them that allows them to maintain a certain standard of living or life in one part, and then suck those resources from other places. Again, that's extending it too far, but I do think we're going to see those types of little city states rising in parts of the world based on this sort of thing. Are you? Does that sound crazy, or does that line up with what you're saying?
No, and I think something that most people don't talk about is just how much wealth there is that's concentrated in a tiny number of people that have immense resources. And sort of, these are not names that anyone recognize. Like, there are family dynasties that trace back to the Confucian era, right, that have hid their gold in Switzerland. There are industrialists that never lost their money throughout World War II, right? In fact, probably made money, right? So that, no, it's not a good historical story because it looks like the bad guys just kept winning, right? And they have a huge amount of money, and effectively, right, like, what to first order, you can sort of model international finance as just like what those people want, right? And it was fine when they were sort of happy to set up shop in the city of London, New York, Hong Kong, done. Maybe a bit of Brussels. Now they're like, all right, we need to hedge our bets, right? We don't trust Hong Kong anymore. We're going to do Singapore. We don't trust Singapore as much for some of those Chinese elites, so we're going to do Dubai, right? And so they're sort of setting up the legal jurisdictional frameworks. They're pouring trillions of dollars of capital in there to essentially buy a state, right? And those are always grafted onto, it's always complicated to separate the dynamics between those like individual, like sort of oligarch type interests and like state interests. And you can almost see it as like a bunch of competing mafias, right, that are like, developing safe territory for themselves. And like, you can model the Chinese government to a certain extent as like a sophisticated mafia system that has taken over the state. Same thing with Russia. Might be politically incorrect to call the United States government a mafia, but like, we have democratic, I'd say, like, buffers. But if you look back to like the World War II, it was a tiny number of like really rich sort of industrial powers that basically rewrote the architecture, right? It was the Dulles brothers, Brown Brother Harriman, a few banks that rewrote the security and economic system, right? And they just, they created the CIA, did all those things, right? So like, you just have to look at history and be like, this is what power does, and you have to see the signs that maybe they're changing their mind, or at least they're hedging their bets. And Dubai, I think, is a great example of this. It's like every other day you see a venture capital fund, a hedge fund, a private equity company. They're just taking planes, first class, private jets to Dubai, doing business deals. And because that's where the money is, right? That's where the net new capital flows are being concentrated. And their business model is basically taking foreign surpluses and redirecting them into, different assets that the West is good at creating, right? Technology company equity, right? Private company equity. And that's their business model. So they got to go where the money is. And that money may or may not have strings attached to it.
Yeah. To steal from an old Chris Rock bit, the next stop on the train that we're talking about is, and it was all the Jews. And I look forward to them figuring out how they're going to craft. Oh yeah, the Jews created the thing in Dubai, and that was really what was behind the whole system. Look, I know that you have to go and I have to go, but before we get out of here, I have to ask you a little bit about aliens. The All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the AARO, put out a report in last month. They found no evidence that confirmed any sighting of a UAP or represented extraterrestrial technology. They found no empirical evidence for claims that the U.S. government and private companies have been reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology. Where are you at? Is it bullshit? Is it appropriately couched so that no, there's actually something to scratch at here? I know there's going to be a volume 2 of the report. Have the aliens contacted you personally and you're their emissary? Tell me where you are.
Yeah, so this report came out of congressional mandate 2 years ago in the FY23 National Defense Authorization Act, and it's taken about 18 months to put together. And the way they wrote the report is very interesting, right? So technically, they went beyond the scope of what the Congress asked for. The Congress didn't ask them to actually conduct the assessments that they did. It was supposed to be a historical review of the U.S. government's activities relating to UAPs going back to 1945. Including an assessment of any efforts by the U.S. government to mislead or manipulate public opinion. That's like what they put into the law. Arrow decided to write a report actually giving like evaluative statements that reference essentially some whistleblower commentary in the public and in testimony to Congress, alleging that the U.S. government and private industry, that elements within there have conducted UAP-related crash retrievals and reverse engineering of technologies of unknown origin and biological materials. This is the definitions that were put into the Senate's UAP Disclosure Act late last year. And so it's created this open question. And then Arrow took it upon themselves to do an evaluation in their report with respect to that question. The way they did this evaluation, and I went to Sean Kirkpatrick's retirement ceremony last year at the Hayden Center, and I talked with him and the current acting director of Arrow, Tim Phillips, at that off-the-record session. So I can't go into what we talked about, but I learned about their procedure that has now become public. And the procedure was witnesses were interviewed by Arrow investigators. The witnesses named a program A. that they alleged either have first or secondhand knowledge of being relating to some of these UAP activities. So Aero would then contact the Cognizant Special Access Program Coordinating Office, e.g. in the Defense Department itself, or in the intelligence community, or in NASA, or in DHS, or in Department of Energy, and say, hey, we have this program, we have allegations it's got, relates to UAPs. Give us the program file. They would get the program file. They look at the program names, the contractors, program staff, and they would go in and interview the program staff. And they would basically say, so this SAT program charter, Special Access Program charter, says it's for reverse engineering, say, North Korean missiles that we retrieve out of the Pacific Ocean, right? Probably a covert program we have, right? Seems pretty obvious. Are you conducting illegal technologies of unknown origin, retrieval or reverse engineering activities without reporting those activities to Congress? And these aerospace executives, program officials, said no, and they signed a memo attesting to that fact to Aero. Aero took that and said, there's nothing to see here. These guys said they didn't do it, so they didn't do it. So you tell me whether that answers the fundamental question. I mean, in my view, it sort of is, well, it's worth the paper it was printed on, right? I mean, if you're going to ask the guys that are alleged to be conducting illegal activities, did you conduct illegal activities, especially something related to this? And they, and they're under no subpoena, constraint. They're under no, legal penalty to lying to Aero investigators. The memo has no legal force. I mean, it seems like it sort of is sort of a meaningless attestation. And so we're in this sort of he said, they said thing. So he said, in this case, David Grush and then other whistleblowers that are alleged to have given testimony to the Senate, Select Committee on Intelligence, not Aero, attesting firsthand knowledge of these programs, and giving testimony under oath to Congress, both closed and open sessions. They have those statements. And then you have, anonymous, not legally forced, sort of forcible, like purgeable statements by program officials who are alleged to be conducting illegal activities. So, okay, like that doesn't, for me, resolve the fundamental question, right? And I think you're going to see some political movements there, right? So the UAPDA, which was like the marquee bill late last year, the Senate passed, and that was effectively gutted in conference committee by House leadership, where they stripped out a core provision that would have granted this new body, review board, sort of subpoena power and unilateral declassification authority over the entire federal government, and also eminent domain authority over any technologies of unknown origin and biological materials. That provision was stripped out. And Mike Rounds, who's a senator, who is one of the co-sponsors with Senator Schumer, is still interested in this subject and gave a comment yesterday that there still need to work out what the differences of opinion are with the House. And so we're sort of ramping up for, on the legislative side, new negotiations over a version of that bill for, the FY25 National Defense Authorization Act. There's also going to be potentially things happening just on the witness side, whistleblower side, that are very angry with Aero for essentially, BSing in this report, and may actually come out and say things publicly, either in documentaries or in interviews or other forms. So I don't think it's the last word here. It certainly was useful to kind of like, from the Pentagon's perspective, kind of like, try to tamp down this subject. I don't think that's going to last very long. We shall see, though. It is a much more complicated issue. We can get into another pod, but I don't think it's going to go away. So I would be on the lookout for certain things in the next few months.
Great. All right. I know you've got a hard stop, so we will pick it up there next time. Matt, this was great. Cheers, man.
Cheers.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.